I am the result of a great program, the Migrant Education Program. Le doy mi más sincero agradecimiento y en nombre de tantas generaciones de estudiantes, today I am honored, I am nervous, and delighted to introduce you to Dr. Joe Mendoza.
You can't help but feel a certain amount of pride when you hear an introduction like that. Although I must confess, as I was listening to the introduction, it reminded me of my obituary, which sent shudders. I have to tell you, it's not easy being old. You forget things. I can remember not very clearly what happened a year ago or 2 or 3, but I can tell you with great clarity what happened 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60, 80 years ago, as if it were yesterday. And one of the things, the symptoms of old age, you forget the things that it'll happen to me here in this presentation. In the middle of my presentation, I'm going to forget my next point. And rather than stand here and look and try to figure out, I'll tell you a story. Do not look for relevancy. Story has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but I am curious, I want to be sure. How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you are bilingual? Because my stories, thank you, my stories are in Japanese and I want to make sure. It has been said, actually, it's an old Aztec saying. Well, not really, because it isn't, but it sounds impressive when you say it's an old. Besides that, there aren't too many old Aztecs around to contradict me, so I'll go ahead and say it. It's an old Aztec saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But few people remember the introduction to that conclusion, which is, progress, far from consisting in change, depends upon retentiveness. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So the question is, what is it you're going to retain from the past? So I'm going to share with you the past. You decide if you want to retain it. But I can tell you, the study of history does indeed make you a better person when you can remember the past and the lessons that you learned. I'm going to share with you autobiographically. I have no idea what that word means, but I love using it. Autobiographically. In any case, what it was like in Oxnard in La Colonia in the 1930s and in the 40s. Before I go there, let me give you a little bit of more history, because a lot of people ask me, and I'll tell you what it is they ask me as I tell you my story here. In 1837, there were about 6 or 8 soldiers, Mexican soldiers, officers who retired. And as was the tradition back then, Mexico gave them some land. So they gave them a land grant, 40,000 acres. And it was called Rancho El Río de Santa Clara o La Colonia. And that's where the term La Colonia comes from, 1837. They sold it in 1865 to some businessmen from back east who formed an oil company. They called the oil company La Colonia Oil Company. There we go again with La Colonia. Unfortunately, they didn't find any oil, so in 1896, they sold it to another group of land developers. And they formed La Colonia Land Development Company. Now, the reason these people bought the land and called it land development was because they started building houses. And the reason they started building houses was because there were 4 brothers who decided they would build a sugar beet factory, which was located just at the end of Meadow Street across from 9th over near Transport Avenue, what it is today. The world's 2nd largest sugar beet factory. The farmers, Mulhart and Borchard, promised them 16,000 acres of sugar beets that they would plant. So Henry T built the sugar beet factory in 1897. And in 1897, the reason that's important is because their last name of the four brothers, Benjamin, James, Ralph, and Henry, was Oxnard. So they named the city of Oxnard after Henry II, who built the sugar beet factory. Interestingly, he didn't want it named after him. He wanted to name it Azúcar, which is an interesting change, a twist in fate. But in any case, Oxnard then was named after the Henry T. Oxnard. 1898 is important because there was a railroad coming, and it should have gone from Ventura straight to Camarillo, but it didn't. It wound around because the ranchers used their influence, and it came to Oxnard. And the railroad station was located on the corner of Mita Street and 5th, 1898. And the reason that's important is because the city fathers named the streets in Oxnard, first, east and west, they named them by numbers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way to 9th, and then north and south by letters, A, B, C, D, and so forth, starting with Oxnard Boulevard, of course, and then A, B, C. 5th Street became the main street because of the railroad station, and so they would go from 5th to Oxnard and cross A and B, and they built the park, the Plaza Park between B and C. And the reason that's important is in the corner of 5th and C was the hotel, Oxnard Hotel, a 2-story wooden building painted red. Had a big veranda in front. They used to watch us walk by. The tourists would sit there. So 5th Street became the main artery because of the railroad and the hotel. That'll be important later, if I remember. And I might not. So now we're in 1898, the railroad. But the second thing that happened was they started an elementary school, San Pedro Elementary School, located on the corner of Woolley and Rose. It was built on the Pettit Ranch. It was an elementary school. That was in 1898. In 1901, they built a new elementary school on 3rd Street between A and B. In 1902, because San Pedro was empty, they vacated it, and they built instead the high school, San Pedro High School. There were about 20 or 30 high school students. That was in 1902. 1903, they built a new high school on C Street between 6th and 7th. 1922, the city passed a bond for $15,000 and built Oxnard High School, located on 5th between J and K, and it was a brick building. We used to go visit it all the time. 2-story brick building. Student population, 100. Teachers, 12. You have 17,000, a bit of a difference, but all right. Now, I've established the history. Now let me tell you what, that was 1922. Let me tell you what 1930 was like. That's my generation. The thing that's interesting about the 1930s, an unintended consequence, if you will, was the railroad, and the station was here, and this is 5th. On this side of the railroad was La Colonia. There's where the houses were built, a couple of hundred. Actually, it was called La Colonia Gardens, but they dropped the gardens and called it only La Colonia. Now, in the 1930s, when I was growing up, on this side of the railroad track in La Colonia, we were all Mexicans. There was no such thing as Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, none of that. We were Mexicans. We accepted it, we believed in it, and that's who we were. Now, the interesting thing, we were all Mexican, and in part, it's because we all looked alike. because we were all Mexicans. Well, let me just interrupt. There was another group that came to work in the sugar beet factory, and that was Chinese, Japanese, predominantly Chinese. But interestingly, they didn't move into La Colonia. They moved into what we called Chinatown. And Chinatown was an alley between Oxnard Boulevard and A Street, beginning on 6th all the way to 9th. They had barber shops and stores. Ashaki had his grocery store and all of that. That was Chinatown. Colonia was only Mexicans. That's all we were. Well, first of all, in part because we all looked alike. We had this beautiful olive tan-colored skin. We had long black hair. Trust me, it was. Now, see, I didn't think that was funny. And we all spoke the same language. You would assume, logically, that we spoke Spanish. And you would be partially right. We spoke in La Colonia of the 1930s a form of Spanish. Let me give you an example. You all, I'm sure, will recognize the phrase, "Hola, Paco, ¿qué tal?" That's international. You can stand in El Zócalo, capital of Mexico City, the plaza, and greet a total stranger with the phrase, "Hola, Paco, ¿qué tal?" They'll recognize it. They know what you're saying. You can go to Central America, you can go to South America, even sunny Spain. "Hola, Paco, ¿qué tal?" Everybody knows it. Except in La Colonia. In La Colonia, you don't stand in the middle of Cooper and McKinley Corner and say, "Hola, Paco, ¿qué tal?" Because they'll look at you and they'll say, "Y este que pito toca en esta orquesta?" They know you're not from La Colonia. No, La Colonia, you had to know the vocabulary of La Colonia, and equally important, the melody. You had to sing it. That was the soul of the language. Allow me to give you an example. I will translate. "Hola, Paco, ¿qué tal?" 1930, Mexican La Colonia. "Pues órale, ¿cómo estás? Pues aquí nomás, jalando la chamba. Hoy si tienes lana, chale, carnal. Pero tengo un nicle." Nicle? There's no such word as nicle. "¿Y tú qué tienes?" "Pues yo tengo un daime." There's no such word as daime. And people laugh that know the language. They do the same. They use words that are neither English or Spanish. My favorite one is, "Comadre, ¿quieres comer lonche?" There's no such word as lonche. Worse, they make it into a verb. ¿Quieres lonchar? And we kept the melody when we learned English. "Teacher, I don't understand." That was La Colonia. All of us were Mexicans. Our parents worked in the sugar beets. Not until really the 20s, lemons started coming. And there was a Seaboard packing house here, still there, by the way, and the street was named Seaboard Avenue. And we rented the houses from the company. And there was a store, and we bought our grocery stores that belonged to the company. Every week, my father would get a paycheck, my mother, and they would go pay the bills. And there was hardly anything left. We had no electricity. We had kerosene lamps. We used wood stoves. That was the 30s. There was no school. We were happy. No school. None. In the 30s, we didn't go to school. We didn't even think of school. All our education came from either Father Marcos at the church or our parents. It's not until 1940 that Ramona School is built. Now, Ramona School is an interesting school. First, all Mexicans. It was a Mexican school. Number two, you could not speak Spanish. If you were caught speaking Spanish, every teacher carried a paddle, about a half-inch thick. They heard you speak Spanish, they'd call you over, you'd bend over, and they would hit you. If they were in a bad mood, they would hit you twice. Whether you were in the first grade or sixth, boy or girl. Among the boys, it became a test of your manhood. If you could get swatted with a paddle and not cry, you were macho. I was a crier. I screamed, I would have made Tarzan envious. Mama! It would hurt like that, would sting. But we had the quietest classrooms because no one could speak English and we weren't allowed to speak Spanish. Silence. One of the things they did in the 41, 42, Second World War was on, they wanted to Americanize us. So they changed our names. I was sitting there and the teacher comes, who obviously was not bilingual, and she says, Jose, from now on, your name is Joseph. Orale, I said, what till I get home and tell my mother? Mama, here's Joseph. ¿Qué Joseph, hijo de tu padre? Ven para acá. Next to me was my cousin Maria. Teacher went, said, Maria, from now on, your name is Mary. So there we were, Joseph and Mary. Until one day, Jesus came. Every morning, she would take attendance. Joseph, Mary, Jesus, and we would cross our paths. We had the Holy Trinity in our room. From Ramona, we were promoted. Not all of us went to junior high. Among Mexicans, even today, el certificado sexto, the sixth grade certificate, is enough. You don't have to continue going to school. That's true today as it was in the 30s. So half of our class would go pick lemons or sugar beets or lettuce or whatever. In the summer, we would go to Simi Valley and pick apricots. Towards September, we would go to Moore Park and pick walnuts. Later, we would go to Santa Paula and pick oranges. That was a cycle. So when we were through with Ramona, some of us crossed the railroad track for the first time. I have to stop here for just a second. For the first time. Why? Because you see, in 1930 and 1940, it was against the law for Mexicans from La Colonia to go downtown to 5th Street after dark. If you were caught after dark, the police would put you in the car and drop you off at the Colonia, or if you got smart, they would keep you in jail overnight. It was against the law for Mexicans to be downtown after dark. During the day, we could not enter the stores. If we did, they wouldn't serve us. So we did what we called window shop. We would just go and look at the windows till we got to Plaza Park. Sunday after Mass, the boys would all be walking around the block in the park, clockwise. The girls and their chaperones, never alone, either mother or grandmother, would be walking counterclockwise. And if you're interested in a girl, you would signal, shrug, wink, do something. If the girl was interested in you, she would smile, do something. And that's how we met girls. And that's about as far as it got. But that was our Sunday. But that was the segregation and the discrimination. We went to Wilson Junior High. Wilson named after the president. All the schools on what we called the American side. Well, that's not what we called them, but for now, let's just go with that. The Americans. We were the Mexicans, they were the Americans. I would pause here, as I will show you later, in just a few minutes, that if you think that concept is gone, I would hate to disappoint you. It still exists today. We as Mexicans perceive this group as Americans. And I'll tell you why later. But let me tell you about Wilson Junior High. There was an office in the middle, then a wing of classrooms going out. This wing was for Americans only. This wing was for Mexicans only. On the American side, they studied reading, writing, geography, arithmetic. They were going to go on to high school. On the Mexican side, we studied finger painting, coloring, crayons, singing, wood shop, metal shop, because we weren't going to go anywhere. There were no Mexicans in the high schools in the 30s and 40s. Now, that didn't bother us. In the playground, there was a white line painted. One side was for Americans. That's not what we called them, but all right. On the other side were for Mexicans only. You couldn't cross the white line. That didn't bother us, except for the fact that the restrooms were on the American side. But that didn't bother us either because the trees were on the Mexican side. We had a boy tree, a girl tree, a third one just in case. So the question that begs to be asked, I would think, is why did we, in the 30s and 40s, accept the fact that we were Mexicans and the only thing we were going to be good for was to work out in the fields, sleep, and have a good time? Why? Why didn't we stand up and march and do something to show our displeasure? We did not. We did not do that. We accepted, and more importantly, we believed that's who we were. That's who we were. We were Mexicans. And even today, at my age, with my experience, it still affects me. Segregation and discrimination is in you. It's hard to explain to someone. It's hard to describe to someone, just as language. Years ago, I had the pleasure of being on a panel with Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of whatever. And he made the comment, which I thought was good, and I told him, you see the world not as it is. You see the world as you are. We're poor and uneducated. We see the world, and we're Mexicans. Mexicans believe in the present and in the past they worship, not the future. Americans believe in the present and plan for the future. You see the conflict we have. So, I'm now going to demonstrate cultural anthropology. I have no idea what that means, but it's impressive. Would you come here, please? Stand right here. And then would you stand next to her, please? And then would you stand over here? And then would you come with her and stand right here? There's reason for my madness, really, right there. Okay. Use your imagination. Face them, not me. Thank you. Use your imagination, okay? Here we go. In anthropology, there's a law. It's called Morris' Law. Morris spent years studying, enough said. Here's his conclusions that as educators, especially Oxnard Union High School District, you'll consider. Step forward 2 steps. 1, 2. This, just for our imagination, is a Mexican. She just came from Mexico and lives in La Colonia in Oxnard. A year, 2 years ago, doesn't matter. Morris says she is first generation. Now, we could argue, but let's accept that at face value. First generation. Here's Morris' conclusion. She, first generation, retains the culture. That's profound, ladies and gentlemen. Retains the culture. That is to say, she moved to La Colonia as a Mexican. She is a Mexican. She still is a Mexican. She will always be a Mexican. She will retain the culture. I'm often asked, who cares? As educators, here's my response. If you know a person's culture, you can predict their behavior. I know that if I'm going to have a meeting and I invite her, she won't come. Even though she'll tell me, I'll be there, she won't come. Why? Because I didn't invite the family. Mexicans work as a family. She won't come. That's first generation. Retain the culture. Now, would you walk over there 2 steps? There. She and her husband, first generation, we're just pretending, by the way, have a beautiful daughter, as you can see. And here's the daughter. Mija, you can say hi to your mother. How quickly we forget. Morris says this is second generation. Second generation, Morris concludes, resists the culture. Why? Why is she resisting? Because of you. You are teaching her to be an American, a new culture, new rules of behavior. But she comes home to first generation Mexico. And mother says to her, you don't speak English here. Here, you speak Spanish. Here's your beans at tortilla. For those of you who aren't bilingual, tortilla. There you are. Second generation resists the culture. This is your EL. This is your confused one. This is the one that doesn't know whether to learn English or keep Spanish. This is the one that's a headache. This one's easy. First generation Mexican, they know they want to learn English. This is your confused. Second generation. Would you go and stand next to her about there? Now, she gets married. She and her husband have a beautiful daughter. Say hello to your mother. She hasn't forgotten the culture. And say hello to your grandmother. Morris says this is third generation. He concludes third generation rediscovers the culture. Third generation rediscovers. They want to go and visit grandma and eat those white round things. They're tired of peanut butter and jelly. When the Chicano movement came in 1970-71, it was third generation. This is the generation that spoke out. This third generation. Second generation is the one that went to war, Second World War. They came back from the Second World War in 1945, and they got married. And did they marry Maria and Lupe and Carolina? No. Second generation came back and they married Betty Lou, blonde, blue-eyed. Worse, a Baptist. Worse than that, Republican. Third generation, Viva Zapata. And she says, Viva who? But she goes to grandma, and grandma says, oh yeah, your grandfather rode with Zapata. Mentiras, but it sounds good. Now, take a couple steps forward. Here's your fourth generation. When I share this story with my migrant parents, I've had literally some of my migrant mothers especially cry when I say to them, the fourth generation acculturates, not assimilates, acculturates, becomes an American, forgets the language, and forgets great-grandmother. And that es el pecado que comete esta generación. No olvidar el idioma. No, that's not a problem. Olvidar los antepasados. No. El pecado es negar quién es y de dónde vino. There's your sin, to forget who you are and where you came from. That's your fourth generation. You may be seated. Give them a round of applause. That was nice of you. Allow me then to conclude and summarize all that I hope I've shared with you. I hope you understand a little bit better. We were first and second generations. We had no school. We were discriminated. We were literally harassed. We were looked down upon. But the bigger sin is that we had no teachers. We had no school. We had no teacher who would stand up and advocate for us. No principal who would lead the pack. No school board who cared. My generation of the 30s and the 40s were lost. But you do marvelous work that you're not even aware of. I have to tell you, I'm blessed, I really am, to live to be 89 going on 90, to be in education 65 years. Let me tell you, let me share with you what you can't see because of your age. I have seen the students, your students, graduate and become doctors, lawyers, engineers, nurses, teachers. I have seen the children of your students go to college, become professionals. I have seen the grandchildren of your students dedicate themselves to the community, become politicians. I have seen that. I wish you could join me, but I don't want you to get old before your time. But trust me, believe, you are succeeding. In spite of all the challenges, you are doing a marvelous job. But let me caution you, because I've seen it. Don't let your fancy positions, your fancy titles, define who you are. Be true to yourself. Be defined by the content of your character. Courage, honesty, integrity, dignity, compassion, understanding, appreciation, mutual respect. All of these qualities you possess. And they're so mixed in you that Mother Nature herself would stop and announce to all the world, here is the school district. That's who you are. And your reward isn't going to be monetary. It isn't going to be a trophy or a reward. Will not be a school named after you. No. Your reward will come years and years and years. When you enter those heavenly gates, you'll hear the words that you shall richly deserve. Well done, good and faithful servant. Thank you.